You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're back for a second episode of Ask Us Anything, Colonial Parkway Murders edition, Robert Gray edition.
That's a mouthful.
It is. And if you weren't here for the intro of our last episode, Robert Gray is one of our longtime listeners who sends us fantastic questions and leaves insightful, wonderful comments. And because he sent us so many questions, I thought let's turn all of Robert Gray's excellent questions into a full Ask Us Anything episode. And actually, it turned out to be 2 Ask Us Anything episodes. So we hope that this is a good start into Ask Us Anything. We are going to open it up to everyone else who may have questions. There were just so many questions, 22 in all, that we wanted to give Robert his own episode to thank him for being such a great supporter and such a great commenter and such a great question asker. Robert, thank you. We appreciate your questions and we appreciate you.
And if you have good questions like Robert, we encourage you to ask them in a future Ask Us Anything. We'll jump right into them and we'll do another episode, particularly if we can find good answers to your good questions.
Yes. And if you ask enough questions, we'll dedicate a whole entire episode just to you.
Wow. I like it.
Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
All right. So we answered 12 questions last episode. And so we're going to kick off with question number 30. And boy, it's a doozy. I'm not going to talk for a couple of minutes. I'm going to sit back here and enjoy a cup of tea while Bill regales you with the information he's got. So the question is this: have any tips come in indicating that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. frequented the Yorktown pub, a location of potential significance to the Thomas Dowski case?
The answer is an emphatic yes. Now, we are starting to get a number of tips, and we've been encouraging people to talk to law enforcement, of course. We understand that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. did frequent the Yorktown pub. Now, remember, we have unconfirmed reports that Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were seen at the Yorktown pub. Remember, folks, this is the 80s. It's Virginia. It's a kind of conservative area with a lot of military people. A lesbian couple that might have stopped in at the Yorktown pub would probably not be involved in any kind of public displays of affection, holding hands or whatever. 2 women could easily have gone to the Yorktown pub. And as I understand it, that was actually a big hangout back in the 80s for a wide variety of people. There were bikers and military personnel, and there was a lot of stuff going on at the Yorktown pub. I understand that it had a different atmosphere during the day when it was more tourists and people stopping in for lunch. In the evening, it was definitely a rougher crowd, and watermen were definitely part of the mix here. And so we are hearing reports that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was one of the people that hung out at the Yorktown pub. A related series of reports are coming into us, and we're again encouraging people to go to law enforcement with this information. We have multiple reports of couples being accosted or attacked while in their cars parking near the Yorktown monument. Kristin, not knowing Yorktown as well as you do, what's the monument?
Okay, so the Yorktown Victory Monument it's a really beautiful statue. Stands very tall over Yorktown Harbor. It has a nice little semicircular pullout near it. So it's up above the Yorktown waterfront, like on a bluff. And around it now, you can get to some nice coffee shops, a few art galleries, nice little B&B, and a couple of the tourist roads that you can get to. I don't know what it looked like in the 80s, because in the 80s I was very young and had not gone out to Yorktown. But the Yorktown Monument, the Victory Monument, it's a very noticeable landmark. If you decided that you wanted to have a nice view of the York River or the moonrise or the sunset, Victory Monument would be a place to go for that.
Now, the reports we're getting, which extend as far back as 1982 and up through the 86 to 89 timeframe of what we call the Colonial Parkway Murders, these are multiple reports that back in the 80s, this area near the monument was a lot quieter than it is now, not as built up, and that there were places that couples would go to pull off and be romantic. Several people have come forward to us and said they were accosted by a man driving the same kind of pickup truck that Wilmer has described, this dark blue, dark green pickup truck, mid-60s, 1966 Dodge truck with faded writing on the doors. Not a cop car, not equipped with any cop car type lights, but he would use his high beams as a way of creating a wall of light, and he would come up to these couples, many of whom had the windows rolled up, because remember, at some point, if we're into post-1986, people had been warned to be careful on the Colonial Parkway and surrounding areas because of the series of attacks and murders that had taken place. So in two of these examples that have come up and been put on my radar recently, these couples were basically assaulted. A man came up to them who matches Wilmer's description. Short, sandy, brownish blonde hair, neatly trimmed beard, wearing a cap but not dressed as a cop. He's dressed more like a mechanic. And he would sometimes flash some sort of ID, but it wasn't a badge like a police officer would have. And he would demand driver's licenses, interestingly, not registrations. And he would demand driver's licenses, and he would tell people, you're trespassing, or you don't belong here, or you're engaged in some illegal activity, or what have you. Now, sometimes these couples would be making out. Remember, we have reports from the earlier part of Wilmer's life that he started out as a peeping Tom. And this is not dissimilar to the Golden State Killer and other serial killers who start out as peeping Toms and then escalate into other more violent activities, rape, murder, and ultimately murder of couples. Actually, it sounds like Wilmer may have followed a similar trajectory to the Golden State Killer. So this man comes up very aggressively, banging on the windows, demanding driver's licenses. In both of these examples, the couple showed him the driver's license. In one example, the driver, who was a man, put it up to the window. The man who matches Wilmer's description was trying to get him to roll down the window, and he refused. A similar situation happened in a second story I heard. The couple cracked the window about an inch or so and slipped their driver's licenses out. And then when he went back to his truck to supposedly run their licenses, they were both discussing it privately and saying, this guy's not a cop, and we need to get out of here as quickly as possible. But they wanted to get their driver's licenses back. They did succeed in getting their licenses back, and they actually challenged him through the window, saying, you're not a cop. Now, I don't know if Wilmer was carrying a gun. We know that he used a gun later on in the Colonial Parkway murders, but perhaps he was reluctant to use a gun or to try to break the window or something like that. These very frightening encounters all happened right near the Yorktown Monument. And then when I did a quick Google Maps search, and Kristin, you know the area a lot better than I do, we're only talking about 0.3 of a mile from the Yorktown pub to where these incidents took place. So it's an 8-minute walk and like a 2-minute drive.
Very interesting to see pieces starting to fall into place as we're getting all of these interesting tips and stories. And again, we just cannot stress enough, if this is something that happened to you, please report it to law enforcement immediately. And that way we can continue to get the ball rolling on this.
One thing that I'm completely baffled and I have to admit enraged by, The National Park Service and the FBI received numerous reports of these kind of incidents back in the 80s. I'm still shocked that given all the information that was coming in, how they weren't able to put together that Alan Wade Wilmer was terrorizing people on the Colonial Parkway. To this day, it's still beyond me.
I know. You can't help but look at these cases and see places where multiple balls were dropped by multiple authorities. And I'm really baffled the same way that you are. Another excellent question. Does Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. have any connection to Liberty Security, National Park Service, law enforcement, or any other relevant persons of interest?
We mentioned these assaults on couples at the Yorktown Monument and along the Colonial Parkway. We're looking into the Liberty Security thing. There's a possible intersection there. We don't exactly know, but this is a very interesting possibility. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. being at the Zodiac Club, the After Hours Club, where he more than likely met Teresa Howell. That's an interesting intersection as we understand it, because apparently there was a fair amount of stuff going on at the Zodiac Club involving drug deals and other things that might have been set up or executed through that After Hours Club. So this is something we're definitely looking at.
Bill and Kristin, outside of the reference in A Special Kind of Evil and Irv Wells mentioning him as a suspect, was Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. on your radar as a likely suspect involved in the CPM cases, or did the recent break take you by surprise? Bill, you want to take it and then I will?
First of all, my father told me the story of the waterman who was questioned by the FBI up at his parents' home in Lancaster County. I heard that story in 1988. Now, there was no name attached to it, but I'd heard the story of the waterman being questioned, cleaning out his truck, being given a polygraph examination after the execution of a search warrant. I'd heard all of that before. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s name wasn't part of that mix, but this was something that my father told me about, which he had heard directly from the FBI as far back as 1988.
For my part, other than that reference in A Special Kind of Evil, no, I was not aware of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. until a couple of months prior, when some of our media contacts let us know something is going down with these cases. This is a name that we have seen. Would you be interested in knowing more? Here's the information that we have. And so as far back as October, I believe it was, we had that information. And so at that point, the name was put on my radar because it was already on Bill's. Did the recent break take us by surprise? We didn't know the press conference was coming until the Sunday night before it did. That's about as taken by surprise as we both were. Like, we had been given this information, we heard the name, and then we were told on Sunday night, there is something coming, press conference tomorrow. And at that point, Bill and I started our frantic calling back and forth and going, what have you heard? No, what have you heard? And so it continued. So yeah, that was the sequence of events. But was he on my radar as anything other than a blip in the book and the information we'd been given? No.
No, I would say 90% of what was announced at the press conference was information that we had in October. We knew the names of the suspect, other people. There was some vagueness about exactly which cases were going to be announced as being linked, but we knew Wilmer's name, we knew his brother's name, we knew quite a bit about him, so we had a good idea of what to expect. Of course, let's not forget, I had the strange experience of being booked by our FBI agent for a 1:30 p.m. call, which is not normally how we do things. Normally, she would reach out to me, text me, or call me and say, can you talk? And I would do my absolute best to talk with our FBI agent immediately, not schedule a call 6 hours in advance. She texted me first thing Monday morning and said, could we talk today at 1:30? And then as the day unfolded, I know I've mentioned this before, Kristin and I received more intel about what was coming. And Kristin said, there is going to be a press conference today. And then when we actually saw the media advisory from our media contacts, Kristin actually contacted me and said, is this our press conference? Because it was so deliberately, confusingly written. It didn't reference the Colonial Parkway murders. It talked about the Isle of Wight murders, which is a made-up title. No one's ever called the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling the Isle of Wight murders. I actually texted back to our agent and said, is your intention for us to watch this press conference together? And she said, no. And then, of course, we ended up having a very good conversation, but it was 2 hours long, from 1:30 to about 3:30 p.m., maybe even a little later. And I realized later, she actually received orders to tie me up for 2+ hours so that I couldn't watch the press conference. And, of course, did they have the courtesy to tell us the press conference was coming? No. And we learn these things from other sources. And I know my friends at the FBI and the Virginia State Police get very hinky when they realize that we know a lot of things that they haven't told us. But the level of communication, particularly with the FBI, is so terrible that we learn all kinds of things from other sources because people actually want us to know these things. They want the families to know these things. They want the advocates, which is the hat that Kristin and I both wear here on Mind Over Murder. They want the advocates to know these things. It seems like the FBI and the Virginia State Police don't want us to know these things, but yet somehow we still learn them.
I think a lot of that, too, has to do with the fact that they don't trust us to know these things. We know that the podcast has been a thorn in the side of the FBI and the VSP for a while now. Hi to our FBI and VSP friends. Thank you for listening. We appreciate you. Because they think that we are going to use it in wrong and irresponsible ways. We are not in any way attempting to do your jobs for you. We are just attempting to facilitate this process of helping make sure that these families and these victims have justice and have answers. But people do trust us with information, which is why we have a flood of tips coming into us. They trust us to do what is right and do what is fair. That is why we do have a ton of information coming to us from outside sources. The FBI and the VSP may not trust us with much. Other people do because they know that we have good intentions. And we're transparent about what we want. We want there to be justice. We want there to be answers. The one thing the FBI and the VSP really seem to have problems with sometimes is transparency. Mm-hmm. We're on the same side here. We really, truly are. We're not trying to do your jobs. We're not trying to get in your way. We're not trying to impede you. We're not trying to contaminate a jury pool or anything else. We just want answers and we want justice. We are all on the same side, but I think sometimes our friends at FBI and VSP think that we're not. We are, truly. This is all that we want.
And as we've said before, we're not investigators. I've had some heated conversations with the FBI at different times. Sometimes they've accused me, you want to solve the Colonial Parkway murders. And I've said, I can't solve the Colonial Parkway murders. Kristin and I aren't investigators. We're not trying to solve the Colonial Parkway murders. We're looking for answers, which I think we're entitled to. The families just want to know what happened. Our perspective, I think, is actually very realistic. We get the fact that when you're talking about a case that's dragged on for 37 years, that there's a real good chance that some or all of the offenders are going to be dead. I think a lot of people that are in the serial killer space aren't necessarily living the healthiest lifestyles. So I don't think we're going to meet too many 90-year-old serial killers. We get the fact that it's likely that some or all of our offenders are going to be dead at this point because this case is dragged on for so long. We're still looking for answers, which I think we have a right to receive answers. What happened to our loved ones? And for what it's worth, we knew all this information about what was going to be announced at this press conference back in October. Did we say anything to anyone?
Nope.
No. Did we leak this information? No. For all the talk about mind over murder and you guys are a problem and we don't like your social media outreach and we don't like the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page, we don't like the Mind Over Murder Facebook page, you know something? Our goal is to seek answers. And if that means that we ask the people of Virginia and people across the country to weigh in about this case and express themselves, I think that's a good thing. If the FBI and the Virginia State Police don't see it that way, so be it. I can't help that. I'm amused by the fact that recently, both the Virginia State Police and our friends at the Isle of Wight Sheriff's Department have publicly commented on our Facebook pages and other social media. In one case, we had a typo in the FBI email address, and I'm not looking to have an argument publicly or privately with any of these agencies. We said thank you, and we fixed it. I find it amusing that the agencies, the FBI, the Virginia State Police, Isle of Wight, and other agencies are monitoring our social media. I think it's great. I actually know for a fact they listen to this podcast, and we make jokes a little bit about we'd like to say hello to the FBI analysts who have to listen to our podcast, but we actually respect the work that you're doing. It might be nice if they reciprocated, but I don't know if we'll ever get there.
Yeah. Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley are not your problems. We're loudmouths, sure, but we're not your problem. The problem is there is a serial killer who is linked to we don't even know how many cases right now. That is a problem. And we would like to facilitate the search for answers to exactly how many people this guy has murdered over the years. If you find that to be a problem, maybe that's the problem.
True enough.
Do you believe Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. acted alone in the Edwards, Knobling, and Howell cases? Do you believe if Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is involved in the other Colonial Parkway Murders cases that he acted alone? In either scenario, if others weren't involved in the crime themselves, do you think there were other people involved after the fact? Boy, this is the $64,000 question, is it not?
Boy, Robert, this is a really good one.
Yeah.
I don't know. Now, our investigators have emphasized to us that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was a loner. They keep using that word. And I don't dispute that. And actually, we've heard from our friends in Lancaster, and hello to all of our friends in Lancaster County, new friends and old friends. We've heard from a variety of people that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was a loner. There are times, though, where I think it's entirely plausible that Wilmer may have approached these individuals and couples as a solo attacker. I think it's actually very likely that he probably used his boat, the Denny Wade, as a way of approaching these couples. I was thinking about this the other day. Man, this sounds like something right out of a horror film. It sounds like he might have actually sailed up to a number of these locations in his boat, which had a very shallow draw that is, it doesn't extend too far down into the water as that type of workboat does. And that he would then park the boat and walk up into these lovers' lane and attack couples. Now, obviously, sometimes the truck is there and sometimes the truck is involved. But there are other times when there isn't a truck scene. Mm-hmm. And we actually think it's quite possible that he may be using the boat.
It's terrifying to think about.
It is.
It truly is.
And I think of myself as a much younger man, kissing with a girlfriend in lovers' lanes up in Massachusetts and various places we lived when I was a teenager. And we weren't thinking about stuff like that. We were enjoying each other's company, listening to music, being romantic. It's terrifying when you think about it.
Yeah.
There are times when I think to myself, it's entirely possible that Wilmer could have pulled these things off alone. And we know he was armed. We know that he shot Robin Edwards and David Knobling to death. So there's a gun involved. So that's a great way to assert control. As Jim Clemente demonstrated for us when we shot the Lover's Lane Murders series for Oxygen a few years ago, It's entirely possible for a well-prepared individual to do a blitz attack where he comes at you. You're a couple sitting there with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're not paying a lot of attention to what's going on around you. And the next thing you know, there's a man at the window, and maybe he's got a gun or maybe he's got a knife. It's really frightening, but I do think he could have pulled this off alone.
Yeah, I agree.
All that being said, though, there are times, and I've been to these crime scenes a number of times, often with investigators, where the logistics of the movement and staging of the vehicles feels so complicated that I can't help but think he could have had an accomplice. And this is where Robert really gets into something super interesting. Do you think others were involved after the fact? Mm-hmm. Even if someone might not necessarily have been there at the time of the murders, it's possible that an accomplice could have assisted Wilmer in the movement of the cars and trucks and the staging of the vehicles. Yeah. And those two things, the lover's lane and the staging of the vehicles after the fact, those are two, as one of the investigators said to me several years ago, these are the two hallmarks of the Colonial Parkway murders. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Yeah, I'm especially thinking about the Phelps-Lauer case and the movement of cars and bodies, and you would almost have to have had someone. With Kathy and Becky's case, if he is in fact responsible for Kathy and Becky, and I am increasingly convinced that he is, that one, I could see him managing that one on his own. I was talking to a friend today about this because this is all that I talk about with anyone anymore, serial killers in this case.
That's sad.
It is, but this person is very interested in this case. And so we spent a lot of time talking about it. And he asks, can you tell me what's going on in the world of true crime? And I'll tell him. He was asking this very same question earlier. And he said, what do you think about this whole accomplice thing? And he said, do you want my 2 cents? And I said, I always want your 2 cents. Absolutely. And he said, look, as somebody who is on the shorter side, which means he's my height and I'm 5'7", almost 5'8". He said, I have learned that you are sometimes at a disadvantage if you are not a tall person. And he said, but a gun is a great equalizer. He doesn't know that from actual experience. He just knows that. He is somebody who carries. And he said, a gun is a great equalizer. And I can very easily imagine a situation where he would walk up to Kathy or to Becky, and the best way to control physically fit, fiery Kathy Thomas, the best way to control her is put a gun on Becky and say, do the wrong thing and I shoot your girlfriend.
Yep.
I can see that.
And he may be 5'5", which I do think needs to be emphasized, just how short and muscular he was. You put a gun in someone's hand and they're 10 feet tall.
The gun is the great equalizer is what he said, and I 100% agree with that. Could I see that being the case with Kathy and Becky and with Robin and David? Yeah, absolutely. Can I see him handling the staging of David's truck by himself with a boat anchored offshore? Yeah, I can see that. I think it gets more difficult with Keith and Sandy. And I think it gets more difficult with Anna Marie and Daniel. At that point, maybe he did decide, hey, I need somebody to help me do the cars. Maybe he evolved. A lot of the things that our profiler friends have said over the years is that serial killers do evolve over time. If this guy tracks the way that I think he tracks, he spent a good amount of time for the first couple of years trying to figure out, how do I make bodies disappear? And he finally figured it out with Keith and Sandy. That's why we haven't found them yet. He finally figured out a way to make people disappear in a body of water. I think that he evolved. And so I do think there's a possibility that he could have done maybe the first couple by himself, but I can see him needing an accomplice later. But of course, that is the $64,000 question now. If he did have an accomplice, who is that person? Are they still alive? Is there any way, if that person is still alive, that we can leverage this information somehow? We've definitely addressed portions of this, but let's go ahead and dig back in. What significance, if any, do you think Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s background as a waterman, hunter, outdoorsman, and owner of a tree service business play in his involvement in the Colonial Parkway Murders cases? Can you spend some time on this subject for a minute and talk about how he fits or does not fit into past profiles done by experts?
I think this is an excellent fit here because early on in 1986, before the rest of the murders had even taken place, they said they thought that a waterman was an extremely likely offender here. Now, they also talked about law enforcement, and they talked about being approached by someone in law enforcement or someone presenting as such. They talked about an authority figure quite a bit. But the waterman theory was definitely part of the mix, and they did look very hard at people that were in the waterman category. So I think Alan Wade Wilmer's background as a waterman, hunter, outdoorsman, and even the owner of a tree service, I think they're incredibly significant. And as we heard from retired investigators who had him under surveillance back in the 1985-86 timeframe when he was suspected of being involved in the murder of Mary Harding, they talked about the fact that this guy was capable of going into the woods and just disappearing. And he could hunt his own food, he could fish, he could literally disappear into the woods for weeks at a time if necessary. So he's comfortable in the woods. He's comfortable on the water. He's an expert marksman and archer. He is an excellent sailor. So he's completely comfortable in all of these varied environments. I think this is really important. And I think this is one of the reasons that Wilmer was able to get away with what I believe will ultimately be seen as a series of rapes and murders. I think he may have been getting away with this stuff for as long as 40 years. It's because he's so brilliant at the outdoors and the disappearing act that he's capable of doing, of blending in and living off the land and the water. While he's quietly going about his business, he's also looking for potential victims. And I think he's found a number of them, far beyond the ones that have been identified so far.
Oh, yeah, I agree on that. The other part of this question that's interesting is, does he fit or not fit into past profiles done by experts? I will tell you this, I would give several fancy steak dinners to know what exactly the BAU's original profile of this case was. I would pay so much money to have that information.
Me too.
Because I really want to know what was the original assessment of this case. What did the BAU think of it? We know it was brought up in front of the BAU at some point. We do not know which agents worked on it. I would again give my eye teeth to know this. There's so much information there that I really want, and I would love to know how does it fit in with
someday.
What the BAU said. I'm hoping somebody out there will be kind enough to provide some of that information. I would love to know. It is very interesting to think about. The next question is, have any personal items, physical receipts, bank records, vehicles, belongings been collected as evidence since his passing and since his identification as the perpetrator in the Edwards, Knobling, and Howell cases? Has his former residence and property been searched in recent years? I don't think we can get into a ton of detail on this, but shall we give it a shot?
I think the long list, these are things I am highly confident that the FBI and the Virginia State Police will be looking at. I know that when he was a tree service guy, we've talked to people who hired his company, and they said he was very interested in cash and cash only. He would only take cash for his services. I heard recently that he would carry a bag and a gun in the cab of whatever truck he was driving, and the bag usually had $5,000 in cash in it and a handgun. Now, whatever happened to that money and that handgun, and I'm sure the money went up and down depending on what was going on with his various businesses, but I think he tried to fly under the radar as often as possible. I'm highly confident the law enforcement agencies will be looking into all these things. I will say this, since this part's been public. We do know that his former residence and property were searched back on January 4th, 2024, because a raid was conducted at that home. Now, that's the home that he died in December 2017. If I'm not mistaken, I believe his son lives there now with his family. But we don't know a lot more about that. And law enforcement is not cueing us into what they're looking at. These are things that the FBI and the Virginia State Police are looking at for sure.
Related to that question is the next one. Has any electronic evidence, browser history, phone records, bank records, hard drives, emails been investigated and surveilled I ask because while these crimes were committed in the pre-digital era, it does not necessarily mean electronic evidence implicating his involvement after the fact does not exist. And he mentions the browser history in the Lisk cases.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be flip here. I'm highly confident that FBI and Virginia State Police would be looking at this kind of thing. I know they did a very thorough search of his home and the surrounding grounds, and I'm sure they'd be looking for cell phones, computers, and other digital devices. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that.
Do you have any information on the geographic area covered by Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s tree removal business and specific job site locations? Have any of those locations been searched for evidence? Great questions. I really wish we could answer more of these.
Yeah, these are things that are not being shared with us by law enforcement. Again, I would think so. It seems to make perfect sense to me. Now, we are just civilians. I think they're going to be looking at all of this stuff. Now, remember, Wilmer definitely tries to fly under the radar in that latter part of his life when he transitioned out of being a waterman. And by the way, some people have pointed out to us recently that a lot of watermen got out of the business in the late 1980s because there were some pretty serious problems with water quality and this whole Save the Bay thing and all the discussion that was going on around water quality. But as I understand it, and I'm reading a bit more about this, in the late 80s, the quality of the water plunged. And as a result, the crabbing and oystering business fell off dramatically because the critters were not doing well.
Yeah, so that's where the Save the Bay initiative came from.
This may have a lot to do with Wilmer's decision to get into the tree business and to get out of the waterman business. It's also worth noting something. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was a highly intelligent man. In my opinion, he got away with rape and murder for perhaps as long as 40 years, extending all the way back into the 70s. He was smart enough to recognize that he needed to get the heck off the Colonial Parkway after he was looked at and had a pretty close encounter, actually, with the FBI. This whole thing with the interrogation and the search warrant and the polygraph examination, I'm not saying it scared him straight, because I believe he then turned right around and killed Teresa Howell and, more than likely, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer. But you'll notice how he's not hunting
on the parkway
anymore.
Yep.
Because that's federal property. That's the FBI. I think he wanted nothing further to do with them because he realized he'd actually had a very close encounter there with federal law enforcement.
Yeah, some of the other cases that people have been bringing to our attention took place in Chesapeake, for example, which is also not the Colonial Parkway. And there's even one down on the Carolina line in Currituck County, which, again, not the Parkway. So I do think you're right, Bill, that after that close call with the FBI and being polygraphed and getting away with it, I'm pretty sure at that point he was like, and we're good here. It's time for other places to go. Do profilers you have spoken to think Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible or involved in the other Colonial Parkway murders cases? If so, which ones and why?
The people we've talked to seem to think that he may be good for all four and many others. They don't think that there are year-long gaps between his attacks. They think that he is out looking for a variety of different potential victims. Interestingly, one of our profiler friends said recently that they thought that Wilmer was looking for variety, which is why he liked attacking singles, as well as the challenge, if you think about it, of taking on a young, healthy couple. That becomes even more of a challenge to successfully subdue and kill two people. We should always remember that this is about power and control and rage.
Yes.
I think this man is full of rage, which is expressed in these horrific attacks against singles and couples. But I think he is constantly looking for something new and different.
We had asked Jim Fitzgerald and Dr. Ray Carr about whether they thought that Wilmer Sr. was a opportunistic or preferential offender. And I really liked their answer. They said, very likely preferential, but he's opportunistic in that he'll take whatever he can get. Singles, couples, whoever happens to be around whenever the urge strikes. And I get, because I have never had law enforcement training or profiling training, I get stuck in the boxes of it all. And it didn't occur to me until Fitz and Ray said it, that you can be both. It doesn't happen to be one or the other. And I really liked the way that they put that, because it made me.
Yeah.
So it isn't, you're not just checking one box or the other. It could be both. It's the same way that an offender can be both organized and disorganized. You can have mixed presentation. You've got elements of both in there. It always broadens my thinking to talk to Fitz and Ray and Jim Clemente and all of our other law enforcement friends who have been so generous with their time and energy. And most especially Laura Richards, who has really given me a lot of good insight and a lot of great things to think about. They have really leapt into this case and taken the time to give us sort of the master class in profiling that neither of us ever had, because we're not law enforcement. We're getting it the hard way, but we're getting it in the best possible way. But I really liked what Fitz and Dr. Ray had to say the other day. And so that's really my approach to it now, is broader strokes and not stuck into boxes. What type of momentum do you think this recent development in the Edwards, Knobling, and Howell cases has to push the other unsolved cases forward?
I hope this will provide a powerful push. The communication, as always, between the families and the law enforcement agencies is terrible, and they are not good about letting us know what's going on. Obviously, we know that we have good news, I would call it, for Robin Edwards and David Knobling's families, and we genuinely are thrilled about that. I recognize that learning who killed your loved one isn't great news, but when you've been looking for answers for 35 years, it's important. And I think it's a positive development, and I hope it gives them some comfort. The same thing for Teresa Howell, who's a family whom we haven't yet met, but I hope that we will soon. For the family of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, this is a very frustrating time now, because they were told by the FBI agents that they are 99% certain that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for the disappearance and likely homicide of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, but we're not quite there at answers. And now for the rest of us, Tomasowski and Phelps Lauer, we're still waiting. We're happy for the other families, and we all work together as a team to try to keep this case moving forward. I would be less than honest if I didn't say that this is a difficult time for all of us who don't yet have answers. I'm hopeful that the momentum will be created and that the Virginia State Police and the FBI will do their absolute best to get answers for all of us in the Colonial Parkway murders.
I think this has been a revivifying moment for this investigation, and I just hope that the momentum holds. I hope that they carry it through to the end, because the Thomases and the Dowskis and the Phelps and the Lowers deserve answers. I really just hope, and dare I even say it, pray, that this will get us across the finish line finally, so that we have not justice, there is no way for there to be justice, so that there will be answers for these families, which is really what we all want. And I think we're all on the same team about that. Robert, thank you so much for the amazing questions. And thank you to everyone who has been tuning in, interacting with us on our social media pages, asking questions. We are doing this with all the hope in the world that this case will eventually be solved, but we could not continue to do it without all of your support. So we thank you all very much for continuing to tune in, to engage with us on the Facebook page, and please continue to send in any tips to investigators that you may have. There is no tip that is too small. If there is any information that you think you can provide about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and his whereabouts or his associates or anything related to that, please make that call. There is nothing insignificant about what you can offer.
You can contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submitting a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. And you can also reach out to the Virginia State Police by email at questions@vsp.virginia.gov. We want to encourage anyone who has any information to come forward now.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.